FeiyuTech just released their brand new Scorp Mini 2. This features quite a few notable upgrades, as well as a machine vision tracking camera integrated directly into the frame. This competes very nicely with a lot of other items on the market, such as the Hohem MT2, and provides additional features such as a focus motor add-on that is sold separately. Inside the kit that I have here, you'll have the fill light, an expansion rod, the tripod base, a bunch of cables, as well as a smartphone mount and a regular mount for your camera. You also get some hex wrenches too. Mounting this gimbal is a little different. You have to turn each of the knobs here and move the gimbal and then retighten them, versus some other ones that go with the latch method. Throughout this video, we'll also be comparing it to the Hohem MT2. However, I can pretty confidently say after this video that I think the title, especially for something priced around $300, clearly goes to the Scorp Mini 2. In summary, as you'll find out in today's video, the tracking, weight, and some of the certain downsides we saw on the MT2 are definitely outshined by the brand new FeiyuTech Scorp Mini 2. The robustness of all the mounting options are very similar to what we saw in the MT2. However, the FeiyuTech Mini 2 is all solid metal, and the only thing that really separates from that is the GoPro mount, which again, you'd want some plastic for flex. The overall design of this includes a back handle, and all of the screen as well as the controls are mounted on the back handle. This means, unlike other gimbals, such as the Hohem MT2, you would have to get a separate handle if you wanted to use this in a traditional suitcase style gimbal setup. And also by having the controls here, this makes this a whole lot more ergonomic. You still have the option for a second hand to come in here and then control things accordingly. However, I do personally prefer the handle like this, and having this already baked in versus having to buy it separate with the MT2 is definitely an added plus. When it comes to tracking, it is pretty much night and day. While the Hohem MT2 does a pretty solid job with its tracking, it really fails in comparison to what we saw on the FeiyuTech Scorp Mini 2. You really can see a clear difference, especially when you start tracking and walking behind objects, as well as the responsiveness, especially when you start moving. I did a direct A to B comparison with the exact same two gimbals set up on two matching Sony RX100s Mark 7s. One of the biggest things that I noticed that was actually more surprising to me was the MT2's tracking module would very easily get distracted, if I would call it, when it got close to the glare of the sun. Now I understand you're not supposed to really put your camera or lenses towards a very bright light source such as the sun. However, it was interesting that even though I wasn't directly facing the sun, the glare often would cause the tracking module on the MT2 to stop. That was not the case with the Scorp Mini 2. I found that the tracking module on here was much more robust, much more reliable, and could track you behind certain objects like a tree and would actually jump to kind of reestablish tracking. It wasn't so easily discouraged when something else happened, and I really did appreciate that, especially when some more challenging tracking situations. Inside moving vehicles, this is the biggest one I can think of. The MT2 flat out was unusable during any type of moving vehicle application. That is, if you were using this inside of a car, if you were driving along, the gimbal for some reason would just drift. It would start changing directions, and especially when you were accelerating, decelerating, the MT2 would really become unreliable. That's a common thing with some of these cheaper gimbals. Sadly, it seems that this gimbal also suffers from that issue. This does a pretty solid job of not kind of changing direction when it's accelerating and decelerating. However, going around corners, the camera will start tilting, and that was very common on the MT2. I would argue this is still slightly better. However, this is kind of the result of cheaper gyroscope hardware in these lower end gimbals, whereas when you start moving up to something like an RS3 Pro or some of the more professional gimbals, they start using higher quality gyroscopes. When it comes to vertical shooting, you still have that option on both these gimbals. This one directly integrates into with the frame, as well as the option for a really nice vertical shooting with your phone, so you can change it really quickly on the fly by just rotating the clip. In terms of connection options, you're going to have all the same, as well as the additional option for a focus motor. It's pretty clear, well and above beyond what you're going to get on the MT2 with no additional focus motor mounts. You also have the standard 1/4 inch screw holes all across here, and actually I personally say in more convenient places. I noticed that one of the biggest problems with the MT2 was that you had some serious issues with screw holes in places that were flat out unusable. I find that all the ones here were much more usable, specifically the ones on top for maybe like a lavalier mic, as well as some ones on the front, especially where you need it when you may often have a lens. The user interface is also once again night and day. By having a full actual screen on the front, you can get a lot more information. While it is a little smaller than I would have preferred, as well as different optional macros that you can also preset to stuff. The locking mechanism, while technically part of the user interface, is also a lot more robust, and I personally prefer this a little bit more. These locking mechanisms are solid metal, and they lock really nicely. When it comes to battery life, I'd say these gimbals are on par. I was easily able to get 3 hours out of both of these, so I'd say battery life is not that big of a concern. If you're getting to the point where you need to recharge batteries, it may be worth considering using the optional power port on the bottom to then charge this separately. You have a lot of different attachment options, and you can easily stack something on the bottom as well to power it. I should also mention a couple other things about this user interface, specifically odd and ends. This grip is all rubber, as well as this grip here. This was not something we saw in the MT2, while it is all plastic. Also, I noticed multiple times if I forgot to unlock this, I didn't really get any notification what was wrong. I really do think that the MT2 does a good job at least notifying you when you have something locked, and while I do normally do a pretty good job of remembering to unlock each of the axes, it does often cause an issue if I'm trying to figure out why in the world this isn't balanced or why the gimbal isn't working, and I just happen to forget to unlock one. I think upcoming in a software update, it'd be very easy to implement something to let the user know what's kind of wrong there. I do think that the build quality, specifically when it comes to grips, is a lot more reliable. This feels a lot like something I can grip a lot better versus something where the MT2, where it is just a singular handle with no rubber holding on the grip, as well as having this optional rod here, means that you get a lot more flexibility in how you hold this device. With the build quality also including the screen and a much larger tripod base, and also supporting larger cameras. Each of these devices include a fill light, and the fill light on the FeiyuTech is a little lacking in certain aspects. Specifically, the MT2 offers an RGB fill light, whereas the FeiyuTech light, I've only been able to get it to increase and decrease the brightness, as well as increase and decrease the temperature. It also does come in with an optional magnetic clip, so you can choose where you'd like to put this. So that means you can kind of select where on the device. I ended up choosing it on the bottom where it recommends. However, you do have some options to include this somewhere else. It is rather small, but I found it is often a little bit brighter than the one on the MT2. Another thing that I also like to mention about this fill light, besides it being slightly brighter but not having color, is it's also completely self-contained. That means that unlike the MT2, you can actually take this and use this anywhere, not just strictly on the gimbal, which actually I personally prefer, because that means that this is something that doesn't have to be strictly attached to your gimbal rig, and you can basically use this as an independent accessory. There's also an included app that comes with this device, and it'll let you basically go through and control a couple of the settings. There are some apps from companies such as DJI, or the one that comes with the MT2 that allows you to actually use the onboard gyroscope on your phone to individually control the gimbal that way. So that way when you tilt your phone, the gimbal also moves. But overall, the app is more of a utility rather than something that you will use to necessarily control this device. I think one of the most important aspects that is often overlooked, especially when you're using this in more of a professional setting, is the fact that this weighs a certain amount. And especially when you start working with larger rigs or heavier rigs, you can get worn out pretty easily. I found that the Scorp Mini 2 is substantially lighter than the MT2. I don't actually have a scale, but I definitely found that maybe just the combination of the handle as well as the other carrying options meant that I was far less tired by using the Scorp Mini 2 than I was with the MT2. This really did make a big difference. Maybe it's just the handle on the back, but I really found that while trying to operate this for long periods of time, this really was much more ergonomically friendly. I also did an A and B comparison between the stabilization on the Hohem MT2 and the stabilization on the Scorp Mini 2. I found that the stabilization was slightly better. However, I often also found that the Scorp Mini 2 was a little bit more sharper in its turns and didn't follow the handle as well as the MT2, but I think that is personal preference and also partly the settings. So overall, let's talk about what my final impressions are. Other than really the user interface telling me when things lock and don't lock, I really can't complain at all. These gimbals are very similarly priced, and if you were to match them identically, basically get this one with the full kit, I think this comes in at $330 with the full MT2 kit, versus this Scorp Mini 2. This Scorp Mini 2 offers a lot more than the MT2 does, specifically with the ability of the added focus motor, if that's something important to you, or if you want that better tracking, and objectively the tracking is better. Also, this handle and this touchscreen means that you can actually use this a lot more reliably, and I personally think that this means that you can just use this and it's much more ergonomically friendly. If I was making this purchase, I would say that there really is no doubt in the difference between these two gimbals. I'd say that the Scorp Mini 2 is the one to go for. However, there is one thing that I think I need to point out that kind of is a bother, specifically with this system compared to something like the MT2, and that is that every time I want to get access to the camera, specifically because the way that this camera works is it's not really accessible to get to the SD card bay and the battery bay, so I have to go through and then slide this back, and I can't get to the SD card bay in the back here even when I open up the door, so I can't change out the battery when I do this because of the way that this mounting bracket is. So I actually have to manually every time remove the camera, and that of course just requires me to go through that. So even when you remove the camera, then you need to use an Allen wrench, and this Allen wrench doesn't go anywhere. It would be very nice if this found somewhere to fit. Like, I'm going to 3D print something. I'll include a link in the description if you want to get one. I would have liked maybe an RGB fill light. That's popular for some people. However, some of that can be done in color grading, some of that can't. But I really think this whole added kit with all these extra features really would mean that I would buy this over the MT2 any day. I was really happy with the quality of this and how comfortable this was to use for a lot of the recording of this video. I do love the MT2. However, it is very clear and apparent that this is no longer something that competes on the same level. I do not have one of the DJI minis to compare this to. However, that's why I've specifically compared these two gimbals. It's not also fair to compare it to the RS3 Pro that I have as well. Overall, I really did enjoy using this, and this is going to become my personal preference over any of the other gimbals minus the RS3 Pro. It's in a different price class, as going forward for something that I would use on a daily basis. This is small enough, lightweight enough, and portable enough to really make a good combination for some on-the-fly shoots. I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you around next time, and goodbye.